Today I'm going to tell you 5 things I wish someone had told me before I started watercolor painting. Whether you are coming to this video as a beginner or someone who's painted with watercolor before, these 5 things are crucial to watercolor practice and will help everyone. First off, I just want to be clear, this video is not really talking about the supplies you need for watercolor. I do have a video all about the supplies you need to start painting watercolor, and I will link that below. Alright, so let's get into the very first thing, and that is, do not use white to lighten and do not use black to darken. Watercolor is a very unique medium, more unique than any of the other mediums because it is transparent. We work from light to dark. And usually when beginners start with watercolor, they think, okay, well, I want this beautiful blue color to be lighter in color. I want a baby blue, so I'm going to add white. Or I want this beautiful blue color to be darker, I'm going to add black. So let's talk about why we're not going to add white and black and what it does to the watercolor when we do. When we add white watercolor to any color, it takes the transparency away. So you can see here that I have a beautiful light baby blue. It's a beautiful color, but now the watercolor is not transparent anymore. And when we are using watercolor, light to dark, we have taken away all the transparency in that first light layer. So actually the solution to make any color lighter in watercolor is to add water. More water gives you a lighter color, and this is pretty much the same color. But it's hard to tell, but can you tell that this has transparency? It has that look that is classic to watercolor instead of trying to turn it into a different medium. I do want to quickly add that you can add white or black to watercolor if that is the look you are going for, but I don't want you to think that that is how we get lighter and darker colors or color value in watercolor traditionally. So what happens when we add black to this blue? Because it does give us a dark color and we're able to maintain the transparency because the black is a transparent medium as well. Well, what happens is we're actually changing the chroma or the color of this blue instead of maintaining the bright value of the blue. So the solution is to add less water. Take the water away, wipe your brush onto the paper towel, take it straight from the pan, and then you can paint with this blue, and it is a lot darker in value, and we haven't lost the brightness and the beauty of the color. We haven't changed the color. Once again, white and black watercolor have their place, but they do not lighten or darken colors. So let's actually talk more about that for number 2. Number 2 is water control is the most important concept to master. And I promise if you're having issues, it's because of water control, even if you don't realize it. So let's talk about water control in this concept of tea to butter. Tea is lots of water, very little pigment. And we're going to think about it more as transparency versus consistency. Tea is very see-through, more see-through than coffee. So coffee is the next one. Coffee has a lot of water still, but a tiny bit more pigment. It is less see-through than tea. Then we get to milk. Milk is a lot less see-through or transparent than coffee. So there is more pigment added to the mixture, and we're starting to get more of a 50% water and 50% paint mix. Now we are going to the right where we're going to have more pigment than water. This is where we get into cream. Cream is when you can start feeling the thick movement on your palette when you are swishing it around and mixing it together. That is cream. That is before you get to the very, very sticky, high consistency of paint that we call butter. You have very little water going on. You have a very dry brush with lots of paint, and it is giving you that beautiful sticky texture, and it is dark, dark, dark. So this is an easy way to think about consistencies when it comes to value. Value is the lightness or darkness of a color, and in watercolor that has everything to do with adding water. So let's create a value scale together, and I want you to try this. It's a really fun exercise. We are going to try to go from the lightest possible color, adding a little bit of pigment at a time, letting that blend together in a naturally progressing scale until we get all the way over to the right with the darkest color. You might be thinking, this is so great to know, but why did she say water control was the most important thing to master in watercolor? That's because every time you pick up paint, you're going to pick up a different consistency based on what you are painting. Because watercolor is all about the consistency that you're putting down in the moment, whereas other mediums like acrylic or oil, it's all about light and the color mixing on the palette before you're bringing the color over to reflect that color. Watercolor is completely different. We are building up to our darkest spots, so we need to know at what point in the painting am I keeping things light, am I painting light, and when do I get to butter? Well, I want to show you when each would be used. So let's first do this value study of a tree using just one color. I did the first layer in tea to coffee ratio. You want that first layer to be super light because you cannot bring the lightness in your watercolors back. Then you start adding more details with more of a coffee milk consistency as everything bleeds and blends together while it's still wet. Then as it dries, I'm using a little bit more of that cream consistency and feeling like, okay, we're starting to create shadows and form, and I can add water like I did here to loosen up some of that really dark paint to create more of those middle values. But you can see that when I have that light, medium, and dark value on even just the tree trunk, there is so much dimension and color and form that I'm building up. And if you started with that medium or dark value, you cannot bring that light value back with watercolor. So you need to know at what point in the painting you add those certain values. Now here in this tree study where we're using typical colors, it's the same thing. Lighter yellow-green colors first, adding in some of those darker greens that would be considered more of a milk to cream ratio as everything is still wet, blending some of that out, and then we can finish with the buttery, thicker paint for the details, especially as everything starts to dry. If you're still struggling with water control, I have one other thing you can try when you're painting. Sometimes we go in and it's just not the right consistency, but we've already painted it on our paper. Keep a scrap piece of paper next to you and practice or do a little swatch on that paper before you go into your painting. That way you can see if you have too much water, too much pigment, or not enough of either one. So keep practicing your water control. You will totally get it. The third thing I wish someone had told me is paper is everything. I wish someone had told me that because I wasted so much time on this flimsy paper that claims to be cotton, 140 pound, all of the good things, when really the brand actually does matter. And it's probably the most important thing that matters in your materials. More than your paint, more than your brushes, paper really is everything. And I'm going to show you the difference between this Canson here on the left and the arches on the right. Honestly, paper is a personal preference. You might totally love the way the Canson or the cellulose type papers look. But for me, I really wanted that toothy, rough, grippy feeling that arches papers or high quality papers give me, because the watercolor just behaves completely different on these higher quality cotton papers. One of the things that hindered my progress the most is I would try to practice on the cellulose papers and I would get really frustrated because they were just so ugly. And then I didn't think I was good enough to paint on the nice paper. But once I started practicing on the nicer paper, I realized it actually wasn't me that was the problem, it was my paper. One of the things that I know hinders a lot of people from getting the nice paper is price. But I promise you, you're worth it, and you can get this Arches pad for not a whole lot of money. Cut the pieces of paper up into smaller pieces so you can get a lot of paintings out of them, and your skills will improve a lot quicker if you use the better paper when you're practicing and you'll like your practice paintings a whole lot more. Your confidence will grow as well. So for me, I really love using Arch's 140-pound cold press watercolor paper. It is rough enough that you get this beautiful texture and the watercolor moves and blends so effortlessly on it, but it's not too rough or too smooth. It's just a perfect in-between paper, and I use it for everything. And some words of encouragement for you, because I hear this often. I want you to know that you are worth using the good paper. You are worth improving your skills because you used the good paper. So try it out. Let me know how you like it. Number 4 is don't be afraid of the ugly stages. I do not hear people talk about this enough in watercolor, and I don't know if it's just me, but when I started painting with watercolor, I would put down the first light washes like I was told to do. Don't start with your mediums or your darks. And it is so awkward. It is so ugly. Without contrast, it doesn't look like anything is going on that looks good. And so I wanted to paint you this strawberry to show you how this strawberry is going to start now. I want you to kind of imprint this kind of bland, flat strawberry, how it is right now. And then we'll see how it is at the end. I'll show you a picture of it later so you can remember. But don't give up on your paintings when they're in the awkward stages. There are so many ugly stages in watercolor because we need a lot of patience. We have to build up from light to dark, all of these different layers, all of the shadows, all of the colors. Sometimes our first wash of color is dull, and we have to glaze another color over the top of it. That's normal. That's how watercolor works. That's the beauty of watercolor. Sometimes those first layers are really, really light and boring because we have to start with our lightest colors first, or we will never have those light colors in our painting again. And you can already see how much depth and contrast and texture and layering is starting to build in this strawberry, giving it so much interest. And you can't do that in the first initial washes or in the first initial layers. So when you see those washes and layers in the beginning of your painting and you think that you've done something wrong, you haven't. This is where we started and this is where we ended up. So trust the process. There are lots of ugly stages in watercolor. The 5th thing I wish someone had told me is take time to understand color theory. Color theory is just so much more important than you might think initially. I like to use the yellow, magenta, and cyan color theory. And once you understand how the colors work together, you will be able to use colors in a way that make your paintings just look so much more aesthetically pleasing. And when you see a painting of someone that you admire and you think, how do they get their colors to do that? It's probably because they understand how the colors are working together. And that's usually through complementary colors, especially with watercolor. I have a lovely YouTube video where I simplified color theory in detail, and I have linked it below, but I want to show you the beauty of complementary colors here in a quick example. On the top we have magenta, on the bottom sap green, and they're complementary colors, which means they are across from each other on the color wheel. It also means if you add a little bit of that color to the other color, you get a muted version of that color. So a little bit of sap green in magenta gives you this beautiful, dark, dusty rose, and a little bit of magenta added to sap green gives you a deeper, army green in this beautiful dark shade. Now, why do we need darker shades? Well, one of the reasons is you could just want a deeper color, but a big reason why people want that deeper color is because they're trying to create a shadow. If I'm painting something magenta and I want a shadow, a more natural shadow than black or blue is using the color's complement to mix into it to create that shadow. So I'm showing you that here. I've painted a line of sap green, and on the far left I have added black. In the middle I'm adding indigo, and then on the right I'm adding the darker muted green for the shadow. And honestly, none of them are wrong per se, but the black looks too flat, the blue looks like it doesn't belong, and then the muted color looks like a darkened version of the original color, which would be the shadow. So it's a great way to have a more natural blend into a color where you're trying to have more depth without necessarily adding black, blue, or brown. So same thing up here at the top with the magenta. On the far left is the black, the middle is indigo, and then on the right I'm doing the mixture, creating that muted magenta color and how it would look for a shadow versus the black and the indigo. And when we zoom in, we can really tell how nice and subtle those muted colors are compared to the indigo and the black. Another quick example of this in a more practical object is using blue and orange to create shadows in a blueberry. So I've painted a blueberry for this top one, but I'm using black as a shadow first to show you how off it feels and how flat and how it doesn't feel like it belongs. But it is kind of our go-to base thought process to use black because we're looking for darkness and shadow. Whereas this blueberry on the bottom, I'm actually mixing orange and blue together to get this shadow color. The reason that this works is because the blue is present in the shadow color and it feels more natural, which makes it look aesthetically pleasing because it feels very cohesive, like it's actually the darkened color of the blueberry because it's in shadow. And I think that's why understanding complementary colors made this list, because it's so important to understand how colors work together to get the look that you want, and everything will look cohesive and beautiful as you imagined. And those are the 5 things I wish someone had told me before I started watercolor, and now I have told you. Even if you have painted with watercolor before, these are 5 essential aspects of watercolor that will help everyone from beginner to advanced artist. I hope this helps you in your own practice, and I will see you all next time. Bye.